Hello, and welcome to week 3 of the BYFI seminar, Beyond Tikkun Olam. This week we're going to be talking about Jews and the Civil Rights Movement. There is a really long history of Black-Jewish partnership in the American Civil Rights Movement, and I would say that the history of tension and misunderstandings is just about as long. From the beginning of organized civil rights activism in the early 20th century, we can find Jews as prominent leaders, participants, and financial backers. And among the heads and lead founders and lead supporters of organizations such as the NAACP and the National Urban League, which are founded in the early 20th century. When we look at the judicial path toward the advancement of civil rights, Jews are just as present there and play important roles both as lawyers and as judges. So let's begin by thinking a little bit about why that is. I would say that American Jews have often felt a kinship with African Americans based on both shared minority status and experience and on the cultural memory of slavery, although obviously it's a much more immediate history for African Americans and a more mythical one for Jews. In the mid 20th century, certain conditions also contribute to this identification. The recent history of the Holocaust made many American Jews more attuned to discrimination and racism and more committed to opposing it. In addition, the widespread post-war success financially for American Jews really bolstered their confidence in the American ideals of equality and meritocracy, which had worked for them and which they believed could also work for African Americans, not quite realizing that anti-Black racism made the African American experience significantly different from the Jewish case. For their part, many African Americans who drew strength from biblical stories of slavery and God's redemption of the children of Israel from slavery and who witnessed Jews' active commitment to civil rights also saw Jews as partners in their struggle. So while the language and the ideals of the civil rights movement drew primarily from Christianity, there was also much in it that appealed to people of other backgrounds. Both the idea that God was on the side of oppressed people as well as the explicit linking of the civil rights movement to the prophetic tradition resonated with Jews. There were some Jews for whom the religious language of the civil rights movement connected directly to their experience of Judaism. For others who really didn't have a religious identity, the civil rights movement became a sort of religion of its own. Liberal institutions within the organized Jewish community also played explicit roles in the civil rights movement. The Reform movement had publicly supported civil rights since the beginning of the 20th century, first coming out against lynching in 1899 and passing resolutions throughout the 1950s and 1960s and beyond, asserting their commitment to civil rights and racial justice. Prominent rabbis of both the Reform and conservative movements were public civil rights activists, speaking out to their congregations, marching with Martin Luther King, getting arrested at demonstrations. Among the most famous is probably Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose photo marching arm in arm with King in Selma in 1965 has become an iconic image of Jewish civil rights activism, and whose description of that march as a form of praying with my legs is often quoted by Jewish activists. For rabbis in the South, civil rights activism was much more complicated than for their northern counterparts. Southern rabbis generally supported racial equality in principle, but were concerned about the practical implications of taking a public stand against segregation and for civil rights. A rabbi's public support of civil rights could strengthen segregationist claims that Jews threaten the Southern way of life. And could put the Jewish community in economic and physical danger. And in several communities, not only were Jewish businesses boycotted, but synagogues were also bombed. In the South, the social position of Jews was somewhat precarious. Jews were often accepted as part of the social fabric. In fact, Jews had been some of the oldest Jewish communities in America are in the South. And in many cities, they were prominent business people and ran local stores, but they were also still seen as different from whites and therefore somewhat suspect. They had to work pretty hard to fit in, and many Jews were reluctant to take action that would set them apart from other white community leaders. They really felt that they needed to assure their own equality and security first. So Southern rabbis did not often engage in mass civil rights protests, but they did educate their communities and quietly encourage them to consider their role in promoting tolerance and equality. There were, of course, some that took individual action, and as a result, sometimes faced violent retaliation as well as social isolation. I'm thinking, for example, of Rabbi Perry Nussbaum of Jackson, Mississippi, who survived the bombing both of his synagogue and of his home, as well as an attempted removal from his position by some of his congregants. Many congregations did try to prevent their rabbis from taking public stances on civil rights issues. And some rabbis were really committed to aligning themselves with the positions of their congregants and preserving their safety. Southern rabbis who did participate in the civil rights movement found it much easier to get involved in activism when they were joined by Christian clergy in their community. This made their own activism less noticeable and less likely to attract anti-Semitic response. There was also often tension between Southern rabbis and Northern rabbis. Southern rabbis often did not welcome the civil rights activism of their fellow rabbis in the North, and they resented what they perceived as the Northern self-righteousness around civil rights issues. They saw Northern rabbis as really having a luxury of taking political stands that would not impact their own lives or the lives of their congregants. Even those who came south and may have put their lives in danger would soon go back to their lives in the North. But their fellow Jews in the South would bear the brunt of the anti-Semitic sentiments that they had provoked. So Southern rabbis often encouraged Northern rabbis to speak from their own pulpits rather than to get involved in communities that were not their own and where they didn't really understand the social subtleties that could harm the position of other Jews. One of the first episodes that really brings Jews south en masse and forces Southern rabbis to face Jewish civil rights activists for the first time are the Freedom Rides in the spring and summer of 1961. Approximately half of the white Freedom Riders were Jews, and as they faced violence and arrest, as Freedom Riders sought to fill Southern jails as a form of protest, Southern rabbis often kind of were called on to minister to the Jews who were in jail. So the Freedom Riders refused bail and filled the jails as a protest measure. The Freedom Rides captured national attention and also really helped to strengthen the Southern movement, particularly SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it increased this trend of Northern students going south to work for civil rights. The other really big project that brought many Jewish students south was the Freedom Summer Project in the summer of 1964, which was launched by SNCC and by COFO, the Coalition of Federated Organizations. And this was a new campaign that built on the community organizing that SNCC had been doing for several years in the South. Freedom Summer brought about 1,000 Northern students who were mostly white, mostly relatively affluent, about half of whom, again, were Jewish. Of the white volunteers were Jewish. They came to Mississippi to register voters, to help organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was an alternative to the state's all-white Democratic Party, as well as run freedom schools and community centers for local African American communities. Freedom Summer chose to target Mississippi because it was the poorest state in the U.S. and the one that had really been least changed by civil rights activism. In 1964, when Freedom Summer took place, 42% of the state's population was African American, but less than 5% could register to vote due to literacy tests, poll taxes, and other kinds of intimidation, physical intimidation. And the point of bringing white students to Mississippi was, in part, to take kind of strategic advantage of America's racism. The organizers guessed correctly that violence against white Northern college students would attract the attention of the government and the nation, whereas the regular, everyday violence against African Americans did not. And then the federal government would then be forced to protect the civil rights workers and stand up to state authorities. It did not take long for this to be proven correct. At the very beginning of the project, really on the first day that organizers were in Mississippi, 3 civil rights workers went missing. These were James Chaney, who was an African American, 21 years old. He was from Mississippi, as well as Michael Schwerner, Mickey Schwerner, who was 24, and Andrew Goodman, who was 20, both of whom were Jews from New York. They were investigating the burning of a black church on their first day in Mississippi in June when they went missing. Mickey Schwerner actually and his wife Rita had been organizing in Mississippi for 6 months with CORE, the Coalition for Racial Equality, and had just returned south with the first cohort of Freedom Summer volunteers. The bodies of the 3 men who had been beaten and shot and buried in a dam were found 6 weeks later. Interestingly, the search for them also had uncovered the bodies of 7 black men whose disappearance had never gotten any national attention, and the murders were never fully brought to justice. Over the course of Freedom Summer, at least 3 other civil rights workers were murdered, and volunteers also experienced about 1,000 arrests, 80 beatings, 35 shooting incidents, and 30 bombings of homes, churches, and schools. In addition to the daily intimidation and fears of violence, Freedom Summer volunteers also experienced a lot on a communal level, a lot of interpersonal dynamics. There was often tension. White volunteers, many of whom had never really had direct contact with African American communities, were not always really aware of their own privilege, of their sense of entitlement, and in some cases of their ingrained racist assumptions. And some of them found the cultural differences that they encountered surprisingly challenging and had trouble communicating with local African Americans in the communities in which they worked. But the intensity of the experience also created a powerful sense of purpose and community, and really, for many of the volunteers, embodied the ideal of the beloved community of blacks and whites working together for a common cause. And so for many Freedom Summer volunteers, this time in the South was really the most powerful and transformative experience of their lives, and is recalled in that way to this day. The Freedom Summer Project succeeded in its goal of attracting national attention to Mississippi and gaining sympathy from Northern liberals. The project also created more than 40 freedom schools, some of which became lasting community-based institutions. And over the course of the summer, about 60,000 African Americans signed up to join the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and the newly formed party sent a slate of delegates to the August 1964 Democratic National Convention, demanding to be seated in the place of the all-white regular state delegation, but unfortunately they were rejected. So at the same time as these large organizing projects brought blacks and Jews together with shared goals and created these very intense communities and experiences, there were also latent tensions that existed and had always existed between the two communities. Some blacks, viewing the inequality and asymmetry between the experiences of the two groups, resented some of the what they perceived as Jewish feelings of moral proprietorship in the civil rights struggle. There also were tensions that arose from the geographic closeness of the two groups, who often shared neighborhoods, which of course is often the result of the exclusion of blacks and Jews from living in other areas. But that shared space could also lead to tension, particularly because African Americans' main contact with Jews in these neighborhoods was often in the form of landlords or shop owners, and some resented Jews for making a profit off of their community. As the situation in urban areas deteriorated and many Jews participated in white flight and left inner city neighborhoods for suburbs and for better educational opportunities for their children, their African American neighbors often felt abandoned and blamed for urban problems and resentful that they didn't have the same opportunities to move elsewhere. Sometimes these tensions took explicit shape in public anti-Semitic statements among African Americans and anti-black statements among Jews. And Jews often felt particularly betrayed by African American anti-Semitism, arguing that blacks should be more generous given Jewish support of civil rights, and that African American leaders should more quickly and fully condemn these kinds of expressions of anti-Semitism in their community when statements like this were made. As the civil rights movement began to focus more attention on northern cities in the mid-1960s, many of these issues really came to the fore, particularly around issues of schools and de facto segregation. Though the majority of northern Jews supported civil rights, they also placed a great deal of emphasis on education, and many wanted their children to attend the best schools possible, and so therefore while they believed in integration in theory, Jews sometimes were unwilling to sacrifice their own children's education to that ideal. In addition, many of the white teachers and administrators in urban school systems like New York's were Jewish. So when conflicts arose between the faculty and administration of schools and the students and parents, as was the case in the prominent Ocean Hill-Brownsville school crisis in 1968, those kinds of conflicts often pitted Jews against African Americans. The mid-1960s also brought a significant shift within the civil rights movement and its approach from a focus on integration and alliance building to one of separatism. So in 1966, SNCC and other radical civil rights groups made Black Power the new basis of their activism, calling for racial pride among African Americans and Black self-determination within the civil rights movement. In doing this, they emphasized the need for self-sufficiency for Blacks as well as Black cultural pride, the idea, for example, that Black is beautiful. And they encouraged white activists to work on their own issues, in some cases, in the case of SNCC, eventually expelling white leaders from their organizations. This was experienced as a real loss for Jews who had been active in these movements and who really considered these communities to be their primary communities, and they felt that they had been, that they were bereft. These ideas of separatism were obviously not entirely new. Malcolm X, influenced by his conversion to the Nation of Islam, which was a Black separatist religious sect, had advocated a platform of separatism in the early 1960s, but by the late 1960s, Black Power had really fundamentally changed the structures and assumptions of the civil rights movement and had inspired new organizations like the Black Panther Party. Another spur to Black-Jewish tension in the late 60s was the Six-Day War. After Israel's surprising military triumph in 1967, many American Jews really felt a surge of pride in Israel, which was an underdog nation that had succeeded in becoming this great power, and they felt a new or renewed commitment to Zionism. There were some African Americans who also saw the Jewish state as a model for historically oppressed people empowering themselves, but at the same time, many civil rights activists began to develop a more critical approach to Israel, identifying with Palestinians as an oppressed group seeking self-determination and rejecting Zionism as a colonialist or racist movement. Some of these tensions around Zionism came to a head in the late 1970s and 1977 when Andrew Young, who was a civil rights activist and the first African-American ambassador to the United Nations, met secretly with representatives of the PLO. And this meeting really sparked an uproar in which Jews were very prominent among those who condemned Young, and this ultimately resulted in President Carter asking Young to resign, which he did, and many felt that Jews had forced his resignation. Over the years, obviously, there have been many other kinds of incidents. For example, Jesse Jackson's off-the-record reference to New York as Hymietown in the presidential election of 1984, the Crown Heights riots between Blacks and Jews in Brooklyn in 1991, and these episodes have flared tensions between the two communities. And when these kinds of events happen, it really tends to provoke in the Jewish community a mixture of both anger and nostalgia about a perceived kind of golden age of Black-Jewish relations, and and has made this kind of a question of Black-Jewish relations one of real public concern and media attention. There are those, of course, who sort of argue that there never really was a real alliance, just this kind of checkered history of connections and collaborations. But for some Blacks and some Jews, this history of cooperation really led to higher expectations about their relationship with one another. And when those expectations were not met, the disappointments on both sides were even sharper. So I think that from our position in the early 21st century, looking back at the civil rights movement, there are many Jews who really like to celebrate the contribution of Jews to the civil rights movement and who harbor a lot of anger and blame towards African Americans about why that has changed. And of course, there are similar feelings on the other side of that issue as well. So it's harder for people to remember that it was a complicated issue for Jews, particularly in the South, to be involved in. There's sort of been a historical forgetting about what some of the challenges were throughout the movement. And we will have an opportunity to look at some texts that reflect both the cooperation and the challenges as we look at the text this week. So I look forward to being able to discuss the readings and these ideas with you on our session on Wednesday night. Thank you.